I'm imagining by this point of the day you've probably seen about 700 slides. So I'm actually going to forgo my slides and just talk and have a little bit of a conversation about who we are as an organization, what we're doing, how the work that we're doing fits certainly in this important initiative that BizFed is kicked off in this series over the next several months throughout the county. So before I get going, just a quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with the Southern California Association of Governments? Yeah, less than half, which is not surprising. So my job, number one, is to make sure when you guys leave today, you understand who we are and what we do and why we do it. So I just want to start there a little bit. So Southern California Association of Governments, we represent 6 counties in 191 cities throughout Southern California. So that means from Ventura all the way out to Imperial County. How many of you guys have been to Imperial County? Not one, two, that's it. So I get there at least 2-3 times a year. So to Riverside, to San Bernardino, to Orange, and of course LA County. So when you think about a region that is that big, it's about 18, almost 19 million people. Like I said, 191 cities, and it's about as diverse as any group of jurisdictions that you can find in the United States, if not broader than that. You think about the desert communities, you think about the mountain communities, certainly the coastal areas that we're in now. We have the highest unemployment rate, usually 1 or 2 in the country in Imperial County. We certainly have some of the greatest wealth that exists anywhere on the planet, certainly in the west side of Los Angeles County and in Orange County. And so our job really is to take that step back and to think about all the different things that you've all heard today and to wrap it up into really one kind of idea and one vision for what does Southern California look like. And I'd like to take credit that we came up with this idea. It really wasn't ours. It goes back really to when President Eisenhower was president. Certainly he was founded certainly the building of the highway system, but it really came from his military background as being thinking about planning and thinking about making strategic investments to make sure you were always positioned best for success. And so when he became president, he brought in some of his old military generals and he says, how are we going to deal with this? The country is growing so fast, primarily in our urban neighborhoods, around our city centers, but cities aren't big enough to deal with these challenges. Counties sometimes aren't. In states, they might not be the right vehicle to do so. So it was this idea that you bring cities and you counties and you group them together in organizations that are now called metropolitan planning organizations with really the task to look out 20 plus years in the future, do some basic demographic understanding about what those regions are going to look like, and then think about what are the transportation investments going to look like, what kind of housing needs to be built, how does all this relate to air quality. So in a quick, simple way, that's what our job is to really take the long view and to understand what are we today, what are we likely to look like, what do we want to look like in the future, and how do we make sure all our different government systems are built and structured and planning in a way to support that, to ensure that we have a robust economy and certainly all the benefits to the citizens that live here that are needed. What do we know might happen certainly over the next couple decades in Southern California? There are a lot of things we don't know, but certainly one that we do know is that there's going to be some seismic activity, right? We could probably guarantee that's going to happen in the next 7 days, the next 10 days. What's the scale of it? What's the size of it? We don't know exactly how that's going to play out. But so we have, over the last 3 or 4 years, taken a much more aggressive approach about how do we integrate resiliency planning in our work. Certainly we've always looked at it from a sustainability standpoint from the environment, but now we need to really take that to the next step and talk about it from how do we include kind of seismic activity planning and resiliency in a broader scale in our planning activities. But before I get into that, I want to talk about what really are our planning activities. What is the core of it? So as I said, from really the beginning of our organization, our goal was to look out 20 years. Federal law actually dictates it and says 20-plus year planning horizon, which means we as an organization look out and we need to say, what is the jobs going to look like? What does the population going to look like? How many households are going to exist 20-plus years out? in that first step of looking at what we say, what are our customers? As any business, you're going to look out and say, all right, who am I serving today? Who do I want to be serving in the next year? Who do I want to be serving in the next 5 years? And how are you going to do different business implementation strategies to ensure that you're meeting the needs of all those people and growing your business and serving them at the main way, at the best possible way? Well, in our job is to we have to look even farther out than that. And that's not an easy thing to do in some regards, but sometimes it's really easy. Demographics, at the end of the day, is not that complicated. Generally, you can guess how many people are going to be born, about how many people are going to die over that time horizon, and that gives you a good sense about what age group, and certainly every age group has different needs when it comes to transportation and when it comes to housing. So that's where our plan is founded in. It's founded in demographics. And a couple things that I think are important that I like to remind them of is just the mere fact of how those demographics are shifting. Southern California has obviously had some extreme boom and some extreme growth years, and we're still saying over the horizon of our next planning cycle, which is actually 2045, so a little bit longer than that 20-plus year horizon, we're going to see 4 million people grow. That number on top of 19 million might not sound like that much, but when you think about the city of Chicago is 2.5 million people, the city of New York is 8 million people, adding 4 million people to what I think we would all consider is a very busy, a very impacted, and a very dense area, is going to take some very thoughtful planning and strategy about where are these people going to live, how they're going to fit, how they're going to integrate into our economy and our transportation system. But what's also changing about that is the mere age group of those folks. Traditionally, Southern California has been kind of a younger area. It's been, vibrant growth after the war, certainly growing through the 70s and 80s. But we're seeing a trend, just as all the country is, and really all of the developed world is seeing, where because of life expectancy and some other variables, that demographic is shifting, whereas about 65% of our growth over this next 20 year is going to be people that are 65 years or older. Now, traditionally, we'd always say, those people aren't going to be working. Some of them will be. But what kind of impact is that going to have on all of our different government structures, all of our different business needs? This is going to be a really big shift, and I think we always need to remind ourselves of that, is we are not planning for what we know today, but we're really planning for what the future is likely to look like, and we know a lot of that is going to be true. There's been a lot of news reports, if you follow it, over the last couple of years that, in fact, growth is slowing in Southern California, that there's an out-migration of people leaving California for other states. There is truth to that, but when you think about, even though a growth rate is slowing, that means we're still growing. And when you're starting with 18 or 19 million people, even shrinking that growth rate down to maybe it's not 5% anymore, maybe it's 2.5%, whatever it settles out to be, you still are getting tremendous amounts of new people that are mostly just children and grandchildren of people that are living here today. So our job is not to plan for anyone else but ourselves, but future generations of Southern Californians. And I think that's always important to remember, because certainly we hope that we're going to instill the same resources that we've had in that next generation below us. When we talk about our organization, too, I think it's important to remember, I mentioned that we're a collection of cities and counties. Well, our governing body is about 86 local elected officials from local cities, mayors, council members, supervisors that come from all that. And so they're the ones that are making these decisions. And we remind them all the time that it's hard for them because they're not making their decisions on their constituents that voted for them, but yet for their constituents that are going to come in the generations after that. So I do want to hit on a couple specific things that I think are important. Certainly, we do a long-range transportation plan, and we do what's called the Sustainable Community Strategy. The goal of that is to look at all our transportation investments that exist in Southern California. We know, we've been doing these plans a long time, there certainly has been a big emphasis on transit, on other type of transportation investments. And unfortunately, we haven't seen the mode shift, people switch out of their single occupancy vehicle to transit as much as we'd like to, and then a lot of other factors are leading to extra congestion. So one of the things that we're really working on this cycle is to really understand how is transportation going to change in this kind of technological revolution that we're in. It certainly is not going to be the only answer, but it certainly is going to beg and change a lot of the different policy ideas that we're debating. And those debates are happening right now, and that's one thing I really want to leave you with, is over the next 6 months or so, there's going to be an opportunity for everybody to weigh in and get plugged into this process. We're going to release in November what this draft plan is going to look like. It's going to look, again, at all these different transportation projects throughout Southern California that have to be in this plan for them to get any federal or state funding. But it's also going to look at what are other types of strategies that we can think about to encourage whether growth to maybe happen in a different pattern that adds to relieving some congestion, that's adding to some of the affordability issues in the housing industry that we've seen. And there's a whole nother process we do on housing that is a whole nother talk for another time, but those are some really important issues that are going on right now. But once this plan is done, and we certainly hope people weigh in and think and understand how it impacts all of your daily lives, it goes out for review. But what I think then becomes most important is how do we implement it? How do we start to make it real? And that's where we work very closely with all the cities that we represent to start to either provide grant funding or ideas or policies. So these ideas don't just remain, in the ivory tower. They don't just remain academic ideas, but they start to get institutionalized. And last a couple of years, one of the ways we really did that, particularly on resiliency, is we partnered with Dr. Lucy Jones. Right after she had retired, she came to partner with us, and she has a very, we think, impactful model of, resiliency by design is how she talks about it. And so she came and worked with all of our cities to really identify not just what's happening as first responders, because I think we're very prepared, or as prepared as we can be as a region on that, but how do we take that step back to a month, to a year, to 2 to 3 years, to today, to start to really think about how do we design buildings differently? How do we make sure systems economically are ready to be brought back online should there be a disturbance? And so I think it's those types of ideas that I think are so important to be shared in organizations like ours, because it's important to think about the long game, but you also have to think about those first steps that are gonna really start to impact some of those change. So I'm already getting to the 1 minute, and that went by super fast, but happy to answer any questions and hopefully have a little time for some dialogue. Yeah, go ahead, sir. Oh, okay.
Thank you. My name's Colin Diaz, President and CEO here with the Culver City Chamber, and I appreciate you. I don't know if it's first time to Culver City or welcome back, but
here all the time.
Figured as much.
Yeah.
So the great work you guys are doing with SCAG, and I had a question because I've talked with a lot of our city council, particularly ones that are part of SCAG, in regards to, you kind of touched a little bit on housing and transportation, right, and those could each be their own separate seminars, if you will. Where do you see the cross-section as you look at the public and private as far as partnership for solutions? Because obviously, from a chamber perspective, we represent, traditionally the private sector, but we work a lot locally, but a lot of the issues are regional. So yeah, where do you see that, or is that something that's going to be addressed in the plan?
So the relationship between the public and private sector has to be strong for anything to get done. BizFed was, I think, one of the first and kind of best examples of that. Tracy and I met a decade ago when we first started talking about these issues, and she got it right away, and I think we got it right away. You can talk about all the greatest ideas in the world, but most of them, if they're going to happen, are going to have to be implemented on the business side. On the housing question, I think the biggest partnership that can happen, obviously most housing is going to get built by the private sector. That's, there's not enough government subsidies that'll ever exist to really move the needle on this issue. But our role is to tell a city how many housing units they should zone for. We have that mandate. It's called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. We do by state law. A city then must go and zone for those housings. And oftentimes, then I don't blame any of the folks that sit on our board, that sit on city councils. You're going to have 100 people lined up saying, we don't want this new housing project here. It's going to bring more traffic. It's going to do this. But as business owners, if your people don't have places to live, if they're driving 3 hours a day to get to and from work, their productivity is going to fall. You're not going to be able to recruit the talent that you need to grow. And so the first step in that partnership is to thinking, which is not easy, which is I think why it's so important organizations like BizFed exist, is to think outside of the thing that you have to do that day for your business and take that step back to say, what's the greater role we're playing in our city, in our community, in our county, and start to speak up on some of those to say, hey, this 100 unit, I don't have any skin in this game necessarily on this new 100 units that's going in there, but I know maybe one or two of my folks might live there, or if that starts to multiply in the area, that I have a better opportunity to get a better talent pool that's going to allow my business to grow. So I think that again is something a whole nother seminar could happen on. One of the things that we started too is doing an economic summit in partnership with the business community. So those that are interested in that, we usually work with Tracy to get some complimentary registrations to some BizFed folks, and we do that in December, and that is bringing those business voices and the public sector voices together to have a real conversation on how to effectuate change.
Hi, Darin.
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you very much for being here, taking time from your busy schedule to be here. We appreciate the collaboration, certainly with the SCAG. But I have a question. Last 30 years, Caltrans has done a lot of bridge retrofitting, seismic retrofitting. Since we're focused on the seismic issues, resiliency, is there anything in our transportation plan, a specific part of the plan that addresses bridges outside of the Caltrans control?
So we do an assessment of all of the bridges as part of our plan, and we have a goal of state of good repair. And so when we put our plan forward, there's, I don't say extra resources, but there are resources dedicated to ensuring that the system is a whole and in state of good repair. And that's certainly part of those funds would go to assessing and making sure that all bridges are up to safety level. It's not, you don't want to be alarmist and cite things for particularly seismic reasons necessarily, but there's been many studies that have looked at certainly bridges throughout California and seen the impacts on that. So those particular programs get managed then by our county transportation commissions, and so if it's off of the Caltrans system, unless it's federal. But so there's that part of it too, but certainly looking at those seismic issues either directly or indirectly is absolutely part of it. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to BizFed for inviting us to be partners in this series, and looking forward to many more great events to come. So thank you. Absolutely.